It is such a pleasure to be here working with the network during these very trying times. Again, everybody, welcome to this session on trying to manage your firm from a financial perspective during these times of economic disruption. As Odina mentioned, I am a professor of accounting at the Stanford GSB, and as a lot of you know, I have participated in the Seed Transformation Network and program events over the last several years. What I'd like to do is really take my expertise, which focuses on understanding how firms create value, and apply it to the situation of the global pandemic. Now, what are the impacts of the pandemic? I mean, obviously, you guys are well aware that the impact has been both wide and deep to your organizations. There's been a drop in demand for companies' products. There have been structural impediments put into place that prevent the delivery of your product or service to your customers. And ultimately, your entire business model had been disrupted due to disruptions with respect to sort of your input markets. Global supply chains have been disrupted. Your workforce may actually have been disrupted due to issues of illness and safety and mobility restrictions. And you may even be having trouble accessing internal and external sources of capital. Capital is growing scarce, as well as your customer cash flows are at risk. So what I'd like to do during today's session is actually spend some time helping you navigate through the financial impacts of the pandemic. First and foremost, I'm going to frame the financial implications of the pandemic in the context of your business model canvas. This is a framework that you're very comfortable using since you've been a part of the SEED program, and I want to have you sort of try to reframe the pandemic and the financial impact of the pandemic in terms of your BMC. Second of all, I'm going to focus on demonstrating how the budget process can be used to help you understand and plan for the financial impact of the pandemic. I know when we were working together during the management performance measurement modules during Immersion Week 4, we spent some time talking about budgets, and at that point, the focus of using budgets was about trying to improve your operational efficiency. Today, we're going to kind of tilt that process. We're going to turn the budgeting process and instead use it as a best practice to try to understand and plan for sort of the financial consequences arising from the drop in demand and the cash flow impacts that the pandemic is having on your organization. And we're going to illustrate all of this using the case of Nairobi Bicycles, which hopefully you've all had a chance to read before today's session. Third, we're going to highlight 4 different dimensions of financial management that can be used to help minimize the impact of the pandemic on your organizations. And these are going to be dimensions or levers that allow you to be a proactive leader, to try to get ahead of the curve and use these dimensions, use these levers to try to create cash and to try to create long-term value for your firm, despite of the fact that your company is currently being shocked by this sort of global economic disruption. And again, we're going to do this in the context of Nairobi Bicycles. This is the brainstorming activity that Odina referred to. And then lastly, we're going to come back, we're going to share out our ideas about how Nairobi Bicycles could survive the pandemic. And at that point, I'm going to demonstrate how cash flow budgeting and the whole budgeting process can be used to help you evaluate the financial impact and feasibility of a lot of the proposed management actions that we'll have identified as we discuss the Nairobi Bicycles case. All right, so let's start with BMC. The first thing we have to get a handle on as leaders is an understanding of how your business model has actually been disrupted by the pandemic, and in what manner has this business model been disrupted. Now, the interesting thing about this particular framework is that the answer at first seems pretty obvious. It's that demand has gone down. That basically you've seen a drying up of revenues because customers just aren't purchasing your products or aren't able to purchase your products. That's the obvious impact. But the impact could actually be a lot more nuanced than simply we don't have revenue, we don't have cash flow. For example, oops, sorry about this, having problems with my computer. We could have a situation where consumer preferences themselves are changing. That basically you're not selling product, not because there isn't demand, but because the preferences of consumers with respect to the product set, with respect to how they shop, with respect to how they engage with you, are actually changing. Moreover, you might actually see that the shift in demand and the shift in preferences is going to vary across product segments, across product classes, and perhaps even across markets. I think even more interestingly is that kind of all of the machinery behind how you service your customers has also changed. You've all probably experienced disruption with respect to your channels. If you operate a physical storefront, it's very likely that you've been forced to close your business or that your hours have been limited. You may also have discovered that there's been a shift in terms of which channels your customers are trying to access your business. Instead of visiting you in person, they're trying to do transactions online. Instead of having face-to-face meetings, you're holding meetings like this over Zoom. Similarly, the whole way you interact with your customers is changing, right? They may actually have a preference now towards a low-touch business model, where your business model was originally focused on strong customer service, engagement, in-person meetings, and the like. Moreover, if you are operating a high-touch business model, you may actually find that it is now impossible to deliver those types of services, right? You expect to have conferences in person if you're delivering some kind of service. That face-to-face meeting may not be possible, or if it is possible, it has to be completely restructured. Even more so, you're seeing that within the business itself, activities and resources are changing. Right, you're finding that a lot of your activities may be restricted. Some of the activities may be redundant because of the lack of demand, because of the way consumer preferences are evolving, because of the fact that your channels have been disrupted. It may also be that certain activities are now becoming more important, right? They're becoming amplified inside of the organization. I'm sure everybody who's tried to pivot from a retail model to an online model has seen their IT infrastructure just be stretched during the course of the pandemic. Likewise, your resources are undergoing sort of a dramatic shock in terms of how they're utilized. Some resources are being underutilized. You have a building, you're paying rent, and you're not using it. Similarly, certain resources might actually be unavailable. Your supply chain's been disrupted, so you're not getting the raw materials to produce your product. Or you may find again that resources are being stretched, right? You have too few of a certain types of items to be able to service customers through the new channels and through the new types of relationships that are being established. And then lastly, let's not forget, all of your partners are also being disrupted. Your suppliers could have problems delivering on time. Your employees may not be able to come into the office. Your banks may not be able to provide you the short-term bridge financing that you're used to. Your investors may be getting nervous. And even the government and the regulators are in the background slowly changing the rules of the game on you in response to their needs, which is to try to address this global health crisis. Now, ultimately, what does that mean from a financial perspective? Well, of course, your entire revenue model has changed, right? You've undoubtedly seen a drop in revenue and a drop in margins. You've seen a change in the mix of revenue that you're likely earning. You're probably seeing shifts in the timing of when you receive cash flow. You might even be worried about collectability because some of your customers are becoming financially distressed. And also, you're probably starting to rethink the role of customer financing in your organization, right? Because by deferring payments, it means you don't get the cash today, or you're worried about collection risk in the future. Similarly, your cost structure is undergoing, dramatic changes relative to the level of activity that you're engaging in. You're probably seeing that you're incurring redundant fixed costs. You're paying for buildings, you're paying for workers, you're paying for materials and other resources that you're not using. Similarly, your variable cost structure may have changed due to decreases in volume purchased and things like that. You may be seeing that on a unit economics level, right, the variable costs are shifting because the level of activity inside the organization is changing. Likewise, transaction terms may be evolving. Just like you want to receive cash sooner, so does your supply chain, so does your employees, so do your bankers. It may turn out you have this weird situation where it's sort of an ironic situation where you have too much capital invested in certain assets, and yet you're finding other resources are very, very scarce. And you wish you could reallocate, but that may be a friction that you're facing right now. And then I think sort of the last thing to think about when you're trying to frame this in terms of your business model, and remember, that's what we're trying to do, trying to frame the pandemic in the context of your BMC. The last thing you may have noticed that your value proposition to the customers may actually have changed in this particular context at this particular point in time. For some of you, your value proposition may have lost value. For others, you may find that actually it's gained value because of the structure of your BMC. And I think it's these issues that we have to really understand if we're going to respond to the pandemic in a meaningful way from a financial perspective. So, how do we actually plan for the financial impact of a pandemic? Well, as an accountant, of course, to me, you have to understand first and foremost how the pandemic, how this crisis, how this disruption has financially impacted the BMC. right? And so that means at this particular point in time, we need to become very good at using our financial information and all of that underlying data strategically. So first and foremost, we have to be gathering data in a timely manner, right? Trends are changing. The environment is adapting dynamically at the moment, right? Every day seems to be a new problem, a new situation, a new opportunity. We need to gather that data timely in order to respond to it in a timely manner. We have to use that data to identify those underlying trends and to try to identify leading indicators as soon as possible, right? We want to be able to react before it becomes a problem, right? We want to be able to capture those trends as soon as possible. Lastly, we want to use the data as a way to start conversations inside of the organization, right? We want to be able to go to our teams and ask critical questions about their dimension of the business and how is it being impacted by whatever is currently occurring in your environment. And it's also to help you motivate the collection and measurement of other helpful data, right? Everybody needs to be aligned at this point in time, and alignment means survival. And so you need data to help make the decisions, to help your organization survive. And that means getting everybody on board looking for the right type of information to help you make decisions that are reactive when necessary, and I think more importantly, proactive, allowing you to get ahead of the curve before a trend becomes a problem. So today's session really is about using this financial data in a way that helps your organization survive the pandemic. So of course, what does survival mean? I think at its most primitive form, for most organizations in the Seed network, survival means having positive cash flow over the next several months and quarters. But I think what we really want to remember is that this isn't just about survival, that we also need to position your company for a successful recovery. And in order to do that, in order to both survive and then thrive once the pandemic and the pressures of the pandemic start to loosen, is we want to be able to leverage our business model to both generate short-term cash flow today, but also position you to be able to capture long-term profits. And that's going to be the focus, I think. That's the theme of today's session. So how do we generate those cash flows? How do we position ourselves to thrive once the recessionary environment starts to ease? Well, in my mind, I think the toolkit you need right now is cash flow budgets. Right? The single most important tool that you can have to help your business survive the financial pandemic, to survive any type of economic disruption, including the pandemic, is a robust set of cash flow budgets. This budgeting process forces you to understand and manage sources and uses of cash within your organization. It's going to facilitate your ability to generate revenue. It's going to facilitate your ability to curb costs. These short-term budgets will also help you evaluate and monitor your organization's financial condition, again, in a timely manner. It's about identifying liquidity constraints sooner than later. And it's about incorporating the impact of new information in different economic scenarios into your thought process, into your planning. And lastly, again, budgets serve as a common framework. Right? They're a common communication mechanism that you can share across the organization to allow you to discuss the challenges tangibly across the organization. It's also an opportunity, it's a tool, it's a framework to help you evaluate the impact of potential management responses. Part of today is about understanding how has your company been shocked by the pandemic. But the most important part of today's workshop, today's session, is about thinking about how to react. And we have to be able to kick the tires to all of these potential ideas. And the budget serves as a framework to help us think through what will happen if we adopt plan A versus plan B. And in the process, it'll help us prioritize where to spend our cash and what type of investment decisions to make. So by way of background, I know a lot of you already have budgeting embedded inside of your organization. The thing though is most organizations, especially organizations that are in the process of transforming, they build budgets that are really more strategic in perspective. They're forecasts that extend over 3 to 5 years, because those budgets are designed to kind of give you some insights about the timing of your investments, about when you want to raise capital or when you need to raise capital. It's all about sort of that strategic transformation. And if you do have operating budgets inside of your organization, they tend to actually be embedded inside of lower levels of your organizations. Your sales team is creating perhaps a revenue budget. Your operations team are, of course, doing budgets about material purchases and utilization. What we need to do in the presence of a financial disruption is we need to elevate this entire operating budget process, right? It needs to be elevated into the C-suite. The leaders of the organization need to be focusing on this information, and they need to be focusing today. Moreover, the focus needs to shift. You need to shift from long-term to short-term budgets, because if you don't survive the next 6 months, you don't have to worry about planning for the next 5 years. Lastly, budgeting needs to become something that it gets ingrained in the sort of week-to-week activities of the organization. Budget assumptions and checking the outcomes related to those budgets needs to happen frequently. At least twice a month, you should be reviewing what your budget was, what the actual outcomes were, and thinking about how do I need to adapt my budget now that I have new information about the performance of my organization. Now, within the organization, of course, these short-term budgets are going to help you survive. You also, though, need to recognize that we still have to have some longer-term budgets. And those are going to be the intermediate budgets from the next 6 to 18 months, because those are going to be the scenarios that'll help you reboot your business once the effects of the pandemic start to ease. And they're going to be the budgets that'll guide your recovery. The one thing that is certain at this point in time is that those long-term projections, 3 to 5 years from now, those projections that underlie your original transformation plan, they're out the window at the moment, because we don't even know what the economic post-pandemic is even going to look like. And so instead, our focus needs to be on those short-term and intermediate-term budgets. All right, now for some of you, this may be a review. We've seen budgeting in the program, but just to kind of level the playing field to make sure that everybody is very comfortable with what a cash flow budget is it basically looks like what you see on the screen here. The first part of the budget outlines your expected cash receipts for the organization. It's going to be about the amount of cash that you're going to generate each period from transactions. It's going to be the amount that you collect from prior sales in the form of receivables. It's about any deposits you receive or any subscription revenue that you receive. It's about income that you earn on investments, perhaps interest on your bank account. It could be any kind of cash you receive from the sale of an asset. And it's also any cash that you receive from external financing activities that you choose to take. The second part of your budget are the cash expenditures. It's about understanding where the cash is going. Is the cash going into inventory and purchasing raw materials? Is it labor? Is it rent? Is it advertising and marketing and the related selling costs? Is it computing costs and IT and data storage? Does it relate to licenses and fees and royalties you pay? Is it just general overhead? SG&A type of topics. Is it taxes, right? You still have to pay the government in an economic recession if you're earning money. It's about any kind of other costs that your organization contextually incurs. It's also those investments that you need to make, right? Investments in R&D, investments in CapEx. And of course, it's servicing all of your financial obligations, interest payments, and required principal payments. Now, of course, together, your receipts and your expenditures yield your net cash flow. And so that's going to be the number, or one of the numbers we're going to be looking really closely at. Can we somehow maintain positive cash flow over the course of the pandemic? Now, of course, underlying all of this information are going to be forecasts about your operations. You're going to have forecasts of revenue, forecasts of cost of goods sold, so that you understand, again, about the level of activity that the firm's going to be able to achieve over the budgeting horizon. It's about understanding your working capital activities and how they're expected to evolve over the forecast horizon, accounts receivable, inventory, payables, and the like. Ultimately, these forecasts are going to span several different horizons. For the first 6 months, you're going to want to build these forecasts out monthly. And the reason is we're living in a dynamic environment. And as such, we want to have a model that allows us to capture all of these trends on a very granular basis, month to month. Because literally right now, we are living month to month. After that, we want to think about the longer horizon. We want to think a little bit about the next quarter or two, all the way out to say the next 18 months. And there we can actually start to aggregate because it's a little bit more of a long-term forecast. The nuances of month-to-month behavior aren't as important as what's happening in the near term. All right, so what are budgets? Really, budgets are nothing more than financial representations of the firm's expected activities and outcomes over a specific period of time. Now, to create budgets, it's a very, very structured process. First and foremost, we have to understand the business from a financial perspective, right? We have to forecast based off of what we know. And so the first step of building a budget is really about creating a foundation of knowledge. And that means digging into your prior financial statements and understand how trends have been evolving over the last several months and over the last several quarters. So for example, this is data from Nairobi Bicycles. The first thing you realize when you look at the financial data is that there's a pre-COVID period and a post-COVID period, basically a period before they were shocked, and then you have a period in which the pandemic has actually impacted the firm's business. We're really going to be focusing on that right-hand side of this data because these are the leading indicators as to how the company is going to operate for the next several months. So the first thing you observe, of course, is that there's been a significant decline in revenue, right? That you've seen a dramatic drop in terms of the volume of units being sold from the first quarter of 2020. The first quarter of 2020 was wonderful, that firm. It's the whole reason why they were about to engage in an expansion plan. But once April 1st started and the effects of the pandemic really started to take hold, you see a significant and material drop in revenue. And you're seeing that the shift is changing as well, that you're selling very little through the retail channel. And yet the private label line actually seems to be sort of holding its own. Similarly, you're seeing rising gross margins during this period because of the shift towards private label, which the data has always suggested offers the firm higher margins because they're not playing the role of a middleman with those international distributors. In terms of what's happening on the cost side, you see that this is a business where fixed costs tend to dominate their cost structure. And during the course of the pandemic, the costs aren't changing. At this moment in time, the founders decided not to lay off employees. They're not able to get out of their rent contracts, and they're going full speed ahead with marketing to try to keep demand up for the company's products. Ultimately, the impact has been a significant swing in profitability. Revenues are down, costs are constant, and you've seen about a $30,000 swing in per month profitability between what was occurring in the first quarter of the year and what happened in the most recent month of May 2020, right? This is going to be, in some sense, the root problem that the company is going to try to solve from a financial management point of view. You'll also see when you look at their statement of cash flows that there's been actually a shift in terms of how they're managing their working capital investment since the pandemic started. They've immediately begun slowing down investment in inventory. Now that's logical because they're not selling as much, and so they're trying to prevent inventory from getting bloated during these early months of the pandemic. And so you see how they're actually moving into a more of a steady state where inventory levels are going to be constant going forward. There's also been a shift towards the collection of accounts receivables, hence the reason why you have this decrease in accounts receivable on their statement of cash flow, right? They're collecting from past sales. They're not really creating new revenue, new receivables, because they're not selling as much of the products that actually generate receivables. You're also seeing the continued use of accounts payable, so they're still trying to leverage their supply chain. And then, of course, seeing just a dramatic drop-off in the amount of unearned revenue the firm has because they're not taking advanced orders from Giant Bicycles. Those are the bicycles that require deposit. And in this particular case, nobody's buying the bicycles, so they're not earning deposits. You're also seeing that they're not making any investments. That was by design. It wasn't a reaction. It was just by design. You're also seeing that they're not investing anything in the development of a new Phantom bicycle, and that's going to be a decision point for them as they move forward through the remainder of the pandemic period. And then lastly, we see that they are servicing their debt. As expected, they're making their interest payments. They're actually paying down the principal slowly, and that they're choosing not to pay any dividends or have any distributions to their shareholders, which is a part of their long-term growth strategy at the moment. When you take all of that together, you have a pretty good picture of the company as a whole. The next step, and it's something I'm really going to encourage all of you to do, is to dive deep into your organization and start to look at performance on a bit of a granular level, right? It's more than just about as a whole. You need to understand how the different components of your business are operating. So when you look under the hood of Nairobi Bicycles, the first place you look is the performance of the retail stores. And what you see here are a couple of really, really interesting facts. First of all, revenue has declined dramatically for these retail stores. It's been about a 72% drop in revenue and a 72% drop in gross profit. That corresponds with dramatic declines in the number of units that are being sold. Clearly, the Giant brand, which is the real premium product, sales there have almost evaporated. It's down to, they sold 2 units last month. Trek bicycles are also experiencing significant compression, close to 70% decline, 68.5. Again, you're seeing that this channel has been disrupted, and it's been disrupted severely. Because fixed costs have remained unchanged, you're seeing a very, very significant compression in operating profit. It's gone from being roughly $15,000 or $14,000 of profit per month to a situation where they're losing $15,000 a month because of the loss in revenue. In contrast, if you look at the private label brand, yes, of course, sales have fallen. It's what you would have expected. But sales haven't fallen as dramatically. They used to sell about 230 units a month. That's what kind of the rate of sale that was occurring in the first quarter of 2020. Now you're seeing sales have dropped in the last month, which was May, and the pandemic was fully in place at that point in time. They still sold 129 units. And so sales were down 43%. That's bad news, but it hadn't been as severe as what we're seeing in the retail line. Again, the fixed costs for this business were unchanged. And so as a result of the compression in revenue and the fixed cost structure, profitability did decay, but it didn't decay as much. They're actually at a point where they're just incurring a small loss, which of course makes you think a little bit about, could a small tweak in their cost structure actually allow them perhaps to convert this to positive contribution margin for the firm? But again, notice how by looking at the 2 lines of businesses side by side, you start to see that the economic behavior of these 2 businesses are actually a little different in response to the financial pandemic. Now, of course, to know why the responses are different, you have to ask yourself, well, what's actually changed from a business model canvas perspective? For the retail stores, clearly the channels were grossly disrupted, right? Nobody wants to shop in person. They're afraid about people are afraid about being in confined spaces. They don't want to go to malls. They may be even prohibited from moving and traveling to the malls if there are restrictions in place. In contrast, the private label line, they're seeing very different forces, right? They're leveraging an online platform. They're leveraging home delivery services. Maybe that's why we see a fundamental difference in the way that demand has changed for these 2 businesses. And it might tie into preferences at this point in time that consumers have with respect to their health and their own personal concerns. Regardless, right, after we've identified what's happening on the revenue front, we need to start thinking a little bit about the other pieces of the business that need to be forecasted out. Right? We're going to take all of this data and now translate it into forecasts. And that means consider customer demand and consider customer preferences and how they're evolving, just like we discussed on the previous slide. We then have to forecast out our revenue, our cost of revenue, and our cost of goods sold and margins. And we have to take into account input costs and competitive pressures and macro conditions. We have to then forecast out the operating cost structure, which again, we have to know, is it fixed or it's variable, and identify those resources that we expect to utilize and the obligations that are expected to be incurred. In other words, we need to forecast out monthly income statements. We also need to forecast out the investments, and we need to think about the types of financial payments that need to be made. But it's more than just an income statement forecast. We also have to think about how those attributes actually translate into cash flows. So when we talk about forecasting revenue, we simultaneously have to think about the role of consumer credit, the timing of collections, and default risk. When it comes to cost of goods sold, we have to focus on purchases, right, versus just what's been sold. It's about new inventory being acquired versus selling inventory on hand. We have to think a little bit about how much consumer credit are we going to be able to use. And of course, for the remainder of the cost structure, we have to ask how much of it is being paid today, how much it is being deferred. And what that really is a forecast of your working capital accounts and how those policies are expected to evolve over the next 6 to 18 months. What will generate, of course, then is a most likely scenario for the firm, which reflects all of the strategic and operational and financial decisions that are expected to be taken by your organization during the crisis. So just to make this very clear, to show you how approachable it is, right, let me demonstrate very quickly how we would create a cash flow budget for Nairobi Bicycles. First thing we would do is we'd make an assumption about the scope of operations that are expected to occur. Namely, they're going to continue to run the retail and the private label line. We would then use recent data, to perhaps guide our forecasts over the next several months. And so in this case, we assume that transactions in the summer will mirror the transactions they just experienced in May. We then, of course, have to make a little bit of a longer term forecast. And so here, the management team assumed that sales are going to slowly start to rebound in September and that they're going to achieve pre-pandemic levels in November. That becomes, in some ways, the basis of the rest of the budget. We're then going to assume that the firm's going to continue to offer customer credit on phantom sales. And so we're going to see that some of our revenue gets deferred in the form of accounts receivable. We're going to notice that that deferral then gets collected 2 months later because of the 60-day credit policy. We're also going to notice that because giant transactions are few and far between, we're still going to require a deposit. It's just that the amounts are going to be low, and that those deposits actually convert to revenue the next month. Together, these assumptions drive our cash flow from sales, right? You're going to see that as a result of these accounts receivable and deposit policies, the timing of the cash collections differ from the firm's revenue projections, but they certainly mirror our overall revenue projection trajectory because, again, these are all a part of the same process. They're all related to the same transaction. It's just that collection, the timing is going to be different due to these receivable and unearned revenue policies in place. We also then have to make forecasts about other forms of cash flow. Here it's assumed to be zero, no investment income, no external financing. And of course, underlying all of this are going to be assumptions about the company's costs. We're going to have to make assumptions about cost of goods sold. And these assumptions are going to mirror the story that underlies your revenue transactions. Of course, we have to make assumptions about what our margins are going to be, what those input costs are going to look like. And here I kind of assume that things were going to be static, that June through November are going to look a lot like May. It's not shown on the slide, but we also might want to get more granular and think about cost of goods sold by product line or by market or by segment. We also have to think a little bit about the timing of purchases. And so that means forecasting out inventory balances. In this case, assume that they were only going to purchase new inventory to replace items that are sold, basically maintain existing levels. Therefore, there's really going to be no change in inventory over time. And so that the only thing that's going to cause a disconnect between cost of goods sold and purchases, or payments, is going to be the use of supplier credit. And so you'll notice that in the budget, we have a place to be able to think about what will our payable balances be. And in this case, I assume that they're going to continue to receive 120 days of supplier credit on phantom purchases. That means that at the time of acquiring certain inventory, payment gets deferred and it actually gets paid 4 months out. And so our budget captures the purchase transaction, it captures the deferral in the month of purchase, and then 4 months later, it shows the cash outflow. And ultimately, these assumptions together drive our estimates of inventory purchases and cash outflows. Lastly, we have to forecast the remainder of the operating cost structure. That means thinking about what activities are going to be incurred during the pandemic period. By assumption, and it's just an assumption, I assumed that the firm was going to engage in the same activities and they were basically going to incur the same costs as they did in May, because this is a static model that's assuming kind of an as-if performance trajectory. I did assume that they're going to make an investment in the second phantom model in July. That's a strategic decision that we can revisit later, but it's embedded in the forecast. Ultimately, I assumed no cash, no CapEx. I assumed that they're going to continue to service their debt. And so we see pretty significant cash outflows occurring over the course of the forecast horizon. The net of all of this, of course, is our most likely budget scenario. It's the combination of receipts and expenditures. And what you see very quickly is that under this scenario, the company is going to be out of cash sometime by the end of July, and they're going to have significant negative cash flows over the entire summer period going into early fall. These are all driven by their working capital assumptions, as we discussed earlier, and underlying all of this is a belief that the company will be unprofitable for the next 4 months and then slowly recover as you move into late fall. Together again, all of this information, which seems like a lot of information, and it is, but all of this information is just being combined into the most likely scenario for the firm. It reflects at a granular level all of those decisions that we think the company is going to make, and it serves as the benchmark for your future performance outcomes. Now, with that said, this isn't where you stop. We need to recognize that managers have to proactively develop contingency plans. And so in addition to developing this most likely scenario, you should also use that same spreadsheet to figure out, well, what's the worst case scenario for your firm? And in the case of Nairobi Bicycles, right, that worst case scenario is pretty straightforward. A, the shock to demand lasts much longer than 3 months. That instead, the demand lasts at least through December, if not longer. Second, the stores have to close. It could be by choice, it could be by government restrictions, but you assume that the revenue from retail model dries up. You assume that you can't shed costs because, let's face it, to shed the costs requires, in many cases, contract renegotiation, and that may not be possible. And ultimately, worst case, you can't sell your inventory. You can't liquidate your inventory in a timely manner. And so if all of those conditions hold, what you end up with is a firm that is consistently very unprofitable for the next 6 months and is going to experience an immediate cash shortfall and rising cash deficits. Right? This data now allows you to conceptualize sort of the magnitude of the challenge you're facing if those worst case scenarios occur. And so what we'd want to do is develop proactively plans to try to counter, plans that respond to that worst case scenario if those conditions start to develop. So what does all that data show us? Well, it shows us that Nairobi Bicycles must respond to the crisis. Assuming the experts' forecasts are correct about a very shallow pandemic recession and a recovery by November, you see that even under those scenarios, if Nairobi Bicycles continues to operate as it is, they're going to need at least $75,000 in new capital just to survive past July. If the pandemic worsens and they're required to close stores, they can't adjust their cost structure, or they're unable to liquidate inventory, they're going to need at least $250,000 of capital. That's the challenge that they're facing. And truthfully, those are probably the challenges you're facing right now. How do we try to think about financial planning during the pandemic? It's about pulling out your budget framework and going through these alternative scenarios associated with raising cash from your balance sheet, adapting your cost structure, trying to generate revenue from your current business model, and thinking about other ways to capitalize on your BMC. And then we assess the viability of these options using budgets. using that budget framework to create scenarios and run numbers. So for example, in the case of Nairobi Bicycle, we have a list of these ideas, right, that they could do. Now, what we want to do then is validate them. We want to see what's the financial impact if I ran with some of these ideas. And so I came up with just some simple ones to demonstrate. First of all, you could just say, well, what if we just cut costs, right? That was one of the first points raised during the report out session. So I made some assumptions about how they could reduce their costs, trimming the labor costs, trimming SG&A, perhaps eliminating R&D related to the phantom bicycles, and then continue kind of everything else as is. And what you see very quickly if you go this route is your costs will look less than they did in the past because you managed to trim the costs. You see the elimination of R&D. You see, though, that all of this activity still doesn't allow the firm to be cash flow positive, and that even with these changes, yes, they can extend liquidity from July to August, but there's still going to be an external financing need by the time you get to August. And so cost cutting alone kind of defers the pain, defers the financial consequences, but there still needs to be kind of a root solution to the cash flow shortfalls that the firm is facing. Now, you could argue that, well, one of the solutions might just be close all the stores, right? Because that's going to allow us to really minimize operating costs. Of course, it means you won't sell any international brands, and it may mean that your inventory remains sort of static, right? Because you're not selling anything. So you have that pile of inventory and you're not doing anything with it. Now, if you go that route, it actually turns out that you do get the cost savings that you would anticipate, but you actually end up in some cases a worse situation because the lost contribution margin of those international sales, those international brand sales, are not offsetting the cost savings. And that's just sort of unique to Nairobi Bicycles, given the setup of their business. Now that, of course, then makes you think a little bit about, well, all right, clearly I need those international brands in order to generate enough revenue to cover just my general operating costs as a company. What if instead of foregoing international brand sales, what if I try pushing some of them through the private label channel? Now, you haven't really marketed that way. You don't even know if that customers are going to be willing to buy that way. So if you assume that maybe you can generate 30% of May's volume, so about 1/3 of what you would have earned if you ran the stores as experienced in May. And what you see is, yeah, okay, we do have more cash flow. It's better than simply closing the stores. We have to somehow create revenue with the international brands, but you still see there's a shortfall. And of course, the shortfall is heavily dependent upon how much international brand traction we get through the private label channel. If we only have 30% traction, you see that by September, your shortfall is 73,000. If you get to about 45% sales volume, your shortfall is 67,000. So you're starting to see a little bit of convergence, but it still doesn't look great. Part of the reason it doesn't look great is because of the behavior of inventory. In these earlier scenarios, I kind of assumed that inventory levels would be replenished. And yet the reality is you wouldn't replenish. You would try to bleed the inventory. And that's something that was brought up here. Maybe move to a model that's more just in time in terms of inventory. In that case, if you don't actually replenish until October, you see that the cash shortfall is significantly less, right? You've improved your cash flow situation. The slow liquidation of inventory is allowing you to minimize the negative cash flow consequences. You still have a shortfall, but you're seeing now how that inventory policy change is actually helping you over the course of the next several months. Now, of course, you can start thinking a little more creative. Remember to keep an eye out, for example, on unit economics. I think one of the teams, and I'm trying to look here on my notes here, but one of the teams said, well, maybe you don't need to close all the stores. Maybe just certain stores should be closed. And I think that comment arose because they looked at the store level data that was provided by Nairobi Bicycles. If you actually look at this data, you realize very quickly that the Westgate Mall is actually doing, that location, the Westgate Nairobi location, is actually doing reasonably well. Yes, revenue has contracted, no doubt about that. But for some reason, this location seems to be less sensitive than what's happening at the other 3 locations. And so one option you might think about is, can we retain one store, maybe Village Market as well, adjust the costs a little bit, try to channel all retail sales through those locations? Would that be a good decision? And it turns out that if you go that route for Nairobi Bicycles, retain the store that's doing the best, generates reasonable volume, which in this case, I assumed 80% of the volume observed in May 2020. And if I don't replenish the inventory to September, I'm actually at a situation where the company's almost financially viable. And that's without really adapting the cost structure at all. You're seeing that by August, you only need $7,000. And by September, the most you might need is $11,000 of additional capital. And that might actually be achievable with any reasonable form of cost savings, whether it be rent reductions, wage reductions, employee costs, and the like. And so what you're seeing is that maybe this is the way to approach the financial crisis. Now, again, there were a lot of ideas raised, right? There were a lot of suggestions. The point of this last bit of evidence, these spreadsheets, is to show you that all the ideas are good. We need to understand, though, are they actually feasible, right, from a financial point of view? And so we like to use the budgeting framework to test the outcomes. If we did this, what will our budget look like? What would our projections look like? And that'll help us prioritize which actions make a lot of sense and which actions may not actually give a real material payoff over the course of the budget horizon. Now, the last thing I wanted to stress, and I know we're almost out of time here, but the last thing I just wanted to stress is that just beware that each action can have an unintended consequence. And this is going to be, as a leader, the types of trade-offs you have to be aware of. If you do liquidate inventory and you move to something like a just-in-time model, the question is will that impede your ability to recover? Will the supply chain recover slower than your business? And if so, that becomes a friction towards recovery. If you temporarily reduce prices, does that actually impact adversely your brand? If you defer payments from your supply base for too long, or you try to extend creditor, payments, are you actually putting them at risk? Because if you lose your suppliers, you may actually be sabotaging your own business. And the list kind of goes on and on and on, right? So ultimately, you need to think about the consequences. And at the end of the day, your projections are only as good as the reasonableness and the completeness of your assumptions. But that said, it's still a great starting point for thinking through how to respond. So, conclusion, what's the best way to help survive the pandemic? First and foremost, understand your business and your BMC from a financial perspective in the current climate. Then elevate the role of budgeting inside your organization. Engage in prudent financial management to generate cash and cut costs. Generate revenue, if at all possible, and be as creative and as opportunistic as you can be. And then use these alternative budget scenarios to help guide decision-making, which actions to take and which actions to forego. And then, of course, be sure to monitor and revise your budgets on a regular basis. So ultimately, I know that if you don't adopt budgets today, you're either going to be blissfully ignorant or absolutely wrought with fear. What I'd like to do is make sure that by constructing a robust set of budgets, you ultimately have a much better sense of the financial paths that you can take and which options are most viable for your particular organization. And so with that, here's your homework. Go back and revisit your company. Look at your BMC. Create most likely and worst case scenario cash flow budgets for your firm. Try to identify those opportunities to generate cash and profits for your organization, and then test drive your best ideas through the cash flow budget templates. And be sure to examine at all times the reasonableness of your assumptions, given what's happening in the environment, given what you know about your company, and be sure to engage your entire organization in this exercise. So first of all, I think one of the major lessons from the last session is just to recognize that you need to understand how your business and your business model canvas has been impacted by COVID, that we need to frame the financial impact of the pandemic in the context of the BMC. It becomes a really powerful lens in which to analyze how your business is being shaped and being rocked by this current economic crisis. Now, again, as we talked about in the last session, the obvious impact is a drop in demand and a drop in revenue and probably a contraction of margins for your organization. What I need you to do is, again, think a little more broadly and look at the entire canvas and ask yourself, which aspects of my business model have been disrupted because of the pandemic? And it can, again, fall through any of these channels. It can be the channels themselves, relationships, your key activities may have been impacted, resources, and the like. The second thing is we need to elevate the importance of short-term and intermediate-term budgets inside your organization. As we demonstrated with the Nairobi Bicycle case, we want to use the budget process itself to help us understand and plan for the financial consequences of the pandemic. And so when we're talking about budgeting, what we're really doing is saying, first and foremost, you need to create a most likely scenario for your organization. And this budget that you're building should reflect the expected inflows and outflows of cash over the next 12 to 18 months. That means you're making forecasts of revenue and margins. You're thinking about how you can manage your cost structure over the next year and a half. You're making assumptions about how you intend to manage your working capital accounts and what policies are going to look like with respect to working capital. And it's thinking about the types of investments you might be making over this horizon. Now, obviously, these budgets are not static. They're actually very dynamic, and they need to be reviewed every so often. I recommend every 2 weeks or so, to basically adjust assumptions or to make changes based upon actual performance being observed inside the organization. And then lastly, this whole budgeting process needs to be a part of a larger improvement inside of your organizations. Inside your organization, you need to improve your internal controls over the use of cash and the flow of information inside the organization. Now, this most likely budget should also be supplemented by a worst case scenario budget that allows you to start proactively developing contingency plans. It means that you need to be perhaps talking to a banker about establishing a line of credit that you would draw down if necessary. Again, this is worst case scenario, but it's about being proactive and having a sense of what would I need to do if the worst occurred. And lastly, it really means, again, inside the organization, elevating the importance of budgets. That's both with respect to you guys at the top of the organization, but it also means prioritizing the budget across the organization. You want to create alignment within the organization to achieving these budget objectives. It's about gathering and using information in a timely manner. You want to be able to identify trends before they become problems. And it's again about updating frequently. And lastly, it's again about building those internal controls, approval of expenditures, and aligning teams to gather and seek information and generate new ideas for the organization. The third key takeaway from the last session is you need to engage in prudent financial management. And you're doing this in order to generate short-term cash flows and hopefully long-term profits. And so something that I did in the last session was I encouraged all of you to explore 4 dimensions of financial management that could help you minimize the financial impact of the pandemic and allow you to ultimately survive this crisis period. And that included things like, trying to create cash from the balance sheet, trying to think about how you can implement cost control and containment activities. It's about seeking out revenue, right? Really trying to maximize the amount of revenue you're generating given constraints. And again, so long as those revenue generating activities also have positive contribution margin. And then lastly, it's about seeking out new opportunities that may have arisen as a result of the current situation. And so again, remember, in all cases, we stress the importance of understanding your business from a financial perspective, making that link between decisions and financial outcomes. It means leveraging your business model canvas to identify new ways to adapt to the situation, to address new customer needs, and to generate revenue. And then lastly, and to me, this is actually the most exciting part, it's about being creative. It's about taking a fresh look at your BMC and trying to identify new ideas that are actually right for this particular moment in time. Lastly, the last key takeaway is, again, having a framework in which to evaluate the impact and feasibility of these actions. And again, I feel that using the budget model, using the budgets as a framework, is a really powerful way to evaluate all the potential actions that are available to you as a management team. And if you do that, what you should ultimately be able to do is get a much better sense of which options are beneficial for your organization, which ones will actually be unsuccessful, and ultimately you'll have a sense of under what conditions those options are beneficial to your organization. So with all of that said, remember what happened at the end of the last session. I asked you guys to go back to your organizations and in many ways perform kind of a self-reflection. I asked you to revisit your business model canvas and try to ask yourself, do I understand how the pandemic is actually shocking or affecting my business? I asked you to try to create budgets to get a sense of exactly what your financial condition looks like today and how constrained you are, how much runway you have before you could become financially at risk. I asked you to try to identify potential opportunities to generate cash and profits for your organization during this period. Again, that idea of extracting cash from today's balance sheet, thinking about how you can reduce or restructure your costs, asking about how can I generate revenue given current constraints? And then lastly, I asked you to be opportunistic. And after you've done all of this, then I said, we'll test drive the ideas through a financial template to actually run this through your budgets and get a sense of what would happen if. And in the process, ask you to think about the reasonableness of the assumptions underlying each of these options and to really try to engage your entire organization during this exercise, because ultimately, the success of the company is dependent upon everybody, again, pulling in the same direction. And so for those of you who didn't attend last time, I think that's a pretty good overview of what we covered and the major themes that I think we were trying to really accomplish, the key takeaways during that session. And so what I'd like to do today, and it was what was advertised in some sense, is I'd like to spend some time really just answering your questions. Because I think for a lot of you, this is pretty self-evident, but for others, there are a lot of challenges with respect to maybe either understanding the underlying concepts, but I think really more pragmatically, there are a lot of questions about implementation. And you're at these points in time where you have to make decisions. And what I'm here today, the reason I'm here today is to try to help you, answer your questions and really help you implement what I think are these sort of 4 steps to surviving the financial pandemic, or surviving the financial consequences of the pandemic. Sorry about that. Okay, so it's early for me, so I apologize for that. So with that, let's kind of go to your questions. Before we seek what's out there in the chat world, let me go through some of the questions that were actually submitted earlier today through the registration process. So I had Odina and Rachel and the team gather a lot of these ahead of time, and so they sent them to me just a few minutes ago. And so I thought, let me just go through these questions, because I got the sense that these are the questions that are really on people's minds, because they kind of appeared over and over again during the registration process. So the first question that showed up frequently is what are the best approaches to cost cutting? This is a great question, because obviously one of the first levers that we tend to pull when we think about surviving a crisis is to pull back on expenditures. It's a natural reaction. It's a gut instinct. And so I think it is important that we talk a little bit about this in greater detail. So the first thing I would say with respect to this question about approaches to cost cutting is I would say you have to let your business model canvas in many ways be the guide to your decision making. You first have to decide what activities and what resources are essential to your business. And those essential activities and essential resources must be maintained at all cost, because without them, your business doesn't function. So if we're going to think about cost cutting, what we want to do is try to eliminate non-essential expenditures. We want to cut down on investments that really aren't required at this particular moment in time. We want to reduce costs that, again, aren't central to operating the business in the moment. It means also thinking perhaps about shedding excess capacity or maybe even outsourcing certain activities if they can be done on a lower cost basis. One of the other areas where, of course, containment could take place is downsizing workforce. But that's a very tricky action because obviously it has a lot of effects other than just budgetary. There's a morale effect. There's clearly going to be a staffing impact. You might not have enough people to engage in the activities. And it could be very tricky to hire back an equally talented workforce in the future. But regardless, your first approach is to identify what isn't essential and try to figure out a way then to reduce those costs first. The second thing is when you look at your essential costs, is try to figure out how to renegotiate costs with major providers of resources. One of the themes that came up over and over again during some of our earlier discussions was the fact that everybody right now is in a crunch. And as a result, there's great opportunities to sort of share the pain, to go back to your suppliers and vendors, to go to your workforce, to go to your landlords and lessors, even to the utility companies, and ask about, is there a way to restructure payments or to renegotiate the current contracts? All parties at this point have an incentive to retain their relationships because remember, your expense is somebody else's revenue stream. And so there is an opportunity, and this is a theme that came out during the last breakout activity when we were talking about Nairobi bicycles, people saying, well, go back and renegotiate, try to get a 50% rent reduction, try to figure out a way to restructure payments to employees. And so ultimately, I think that the second approach is to try to think about renegotiation. I think the third approach, and one that is sort of, the third approach is to try to restructure costs. This is a much deeper challenge than just renegotiating. It's about going back and looking at the behavior of your cost structure itself and what drives that cost and asking, can we actually change the fundamental relationship between business activity and the costs we incur? So for example, it might be converting fixed costs to variable cost, if at all possible. It might mean about trying to reformulate how we use resources. So like for example, with the topic of employees, one approach is to just eliminate your employees. The other is to perhaps adopt some kind of employment practice that reduces your cost, but still retains the workforce. I know that in some countries, particularly Germany, there's this concept of short work practices, where basically everybody inside the organization just works less. And so what you're doing basically is reducing labor capacity. Now you only get paid half as much, but individuals still retain employment, they still retain their benefits, and it allows you to cut back on your cost structure. And more generally, there could be times when you could convert, for example, an employee from having a salary to maybe having a small salary plus commission. So if you're running a retail location, for this period of the pandemic, maybe you put part of their salary at risk, but at the same time, as you start to recover, they benefit from the recovery because of higher commissions and the like. And there's all kinds of other non-cash arrangements that perhaps could be used, or profit sharing arrangements that could be used to try to cut costs. In general, though, it's usually about taking fixed costs and trying to make them a bit more variable during this pandemic period. And then again, I think the last approach is to just really revisit all of your relationships. Renegotiation, again, may be possible. It may also mean that maybe now is an opportune time to look for an alternative vendor of whatever service or product that you need, because you may be able to find somebody of equal quality who's willing to give you a lower price, which again is your input cost because of the pandemic. So again, great question. I want to thank that one for being submitted. And I think it's really sort of a first order issue that a lot of you are addressing. So the second question is another interesting one. The question is it worth continuing to run the business if your cash flows predict your business cannot survive the year? It's a fabulous question, right? Because I know that a lot of you went out and created your most likely budgets, and you, like Nairobi Bicycles, realized, wow, we might be out of cash by the end of the year. Should we continue? Is it worth it? And the answer is absolutely, it's worth to continue running the business. Remember that what you just did with your budgeting process is identify a set of assumptions about how the company is going to be run And what this budget is showing you is what the outcome will be if you continue to run the business as projected. What this lack of cash flow shows you is that your business can't survive as it's currently being operated. But that doesn't mean you don't have opportunities to adapt. And so part of the challenge from the last workshop, and I think what a lot of you have to do after today's workshop, is revisit your business and be creative and ask, how can I adapt the business to turn my negative cash flow situation into a positive cash flow situation? And it may mean looking at those assumptions. You may have thought you were aggressive. You may have thought you were creative, but it means going back and trying to revisit and say, what else can I do? And some of it, you may be at the end of the road. There may be no more cash, no more costs to cut. There's no more cash to extract from the balance sheet. But that doesn't mean there aren't opportunities to still create positive revenue value, to create revenue that has value. And it doesn't mean that you're out of opportunities, that you're out of ways to use your business model to your advantage. I mean, sadly, a few firms may never actually survive. But generally, if you have a healthy business going into the pandemic, you should have a reasonable chance of surviving if you adapt. And we'll talk a little bit more about this at the end of today's session. The third question, how critical is forward-looking cash flow, especially if we're a working capital positive company? This actually ties a lot into the question before this. So the easiest way to answer this question is cash flow in and of itself isn't the only reason you're going to survive. It isn't the only reason you're going to fail. That ultimately survival is a function of today's working capital position. If you have significant cash reserves, if you have significant receivables to be collected, if you have significant amount of inventory that can be sold, right, that improves your chances of survival. Cash flow, of course, in the future ties a lot to the expected profitability of the firm. And so what we're doing is we're basically looking at both signals, or we're looking at both pieces of information to understand whether or not the company is going to survive. Now, in terms of this question itself, having positive working capital is certainly really, really, really good for the short run. But remember, in the case of an economic disruption like we're experiencing today, you will burn through cash very quickly if your firm is unprofitable. You'll burn through cash quickly if you have negative free cash flows. The same is true with respect to accounts receivable. Accounts receivable on your balance sheet today is really all about what happened in the past. You made sales a month ago, 2 months ago, and those collections are going to give you a lot of liquidity over the next several months. But the question is can you continue to generate value in the future? And that's what the budgets are really telling us. That really, once we get past the collection of past receivables, once we use up what cash reserves we have, will we be generating sufficient profitability? Will we be generating sufficient cash to survive over that slightly longer horizon beyond the next couple of months? And so forward-looking cash is relevant, and it becomes more relevant as you start seeing your liquidity on the balance sheet contract. Now, there's also a couple of other issues in play too, right? There's the issues of what's happening on the other side of the balance sheet. If you're being given a lot of supplier credit, again, that's very helpful, but it helps you in that it actually creates cash flow. It requires less usage of your resources today. If you're receiving deposits or subscriptions in advance, right, that's going to cause today's cash balances to be high. But again, survival depends upon continuation of those transactions as we move into the future. So it's a great question, and it really just highlights the importance of understanding the dynamics of your operating cycle. It's about understanding the dynamics of your net trade cycle. And what you're looking for, right, is ultimately trying to make those as efficient as possible, and in the process, magnify the amount of activity that's just taking place within the organization. And that activity is somehow generating revenue during the pandemic period. So again, great question, great pair of questions. The fourth question, how prudent is it to take debt to tide over a company's temporary short-term cash flow issues, specifically for an organization that is otherwise debt-free? This is a great question. A lot of organizations are very hesitant to use debt. That hesitancy is amplified when interest rates are very high, such as we see in parts of Africa and really many parts of the world, South America as well. And so the answer to this is really a nuanced answer. Um, Obviously, debt imposes constraints upon a firm, right? Creditors might get decision rights inside your organization. You have to service the debt, which of course bleeds off some of your cash flow that you might otherwise reinvest into the business. And so taking on debt is inherently risky. The question though is should you use it to tide over a temporary deficiency in cash flows or a shortfall in your cash balance? And my answer, and it's a bit of an academic answer, but I am a professor after all. The answer is really about financial flexibility, right? If you know that your business is going to recover, if you have a strong sense, you never know, but if you have a strong sense that once we get through the worst of the pandemic, that revenue is going to return, customers are going to return, you're going to be able to engage in business because you have that strong competitive position. You have that product that people need and want. If you know that to be the likely outcome, then debt is a lifeline. There's a reason that companies large and small have things like lines of credit established with banks in advance. And it's exactly for this reason. It's about using debt as a mechanism to bridge a period of economic uncertainty, to basically bridge bad economic conditions. And so again, we may not like having debt, and it does impose risk and constraints, but it is one of the most impactful tools to be able to bridge today to tomorrow. And so if it's the only way that you can bridge, meaning you're unable to generate revenue, you're unable to liquidate some of your assets into cash, if those options are gone, this does become sort of the next lever of financial flexibility. What I would be careful in this case is, one, make sure that the horizon over which you have the loan is sufficient to get you to the end, to basically allow you to enter the recovery period. Because the last thing you need is to take a loan that, for example, comes due in August, and yet the pandemic or the effects of the pandemic aren't expected to ease up until the fall or even next winter. So you want the horizon, the duration of the loan, to basically be long enough to get you to the recovery period. The second thing is you want to look at the terms of the loan. Obviously, lower interest rates are better than higher, but that's sort of self-evident. But it may also be about the timing of the payments. You may actually look for a loan where you defer all payments until you pay the principal back, because that way you're not having to use any of the intermediate cash flow to service the debt. Particularly, you're not using the proceeds of the debt to service the debt. What you want to do is you want to use that loan for operations, and then ultimately let your operational activities during the recovery period pay back the loan. So again, not everybody is comfortable doing this, but short-term loans to solve a short-term cash flow problem is a very common tool. And it's a way of enabling some financial flexibility inside the organization. That actually ties into the next question, which is this notion of, what do you do if you feel that your debt level is too high to be able to continue the business? Of course, as we become financially distressed as an organization, the debt levels start to feel very restrictive, and they actually start to feel like a constraint. The one thing I'll mention at this particular point in time, and I thought this was an interesting question because it's something we haven't really talked about at all in the SEED program, at least as I recall, is that when you talk about debt, you have to remember that creditors always prefer to be paid than to have to deal with liquidation, right? They don't really want your assets given to them in lieu of the debt payment. It's very costly for them to liquidate your business. It's very difficult, it's challenging, it's time consuming. They would be much more inclined to restructure debt than to force liquidation. And so I would say that if you're feeling like debt is becoming a constraint, always reach out to the creditors and talk about restructuring, because they know that if it becomes a case of bankruptcy, if it becomes a case of forced liquidation, they're likely to lose, and they're going to lose a lot for the investment that they made. And so always talk about renegotiation and restructuring before you start thinking about just handing the business over to someone else. And I think the same actually applies to any form of credit, and that includes suppliers, which is the next question. All right, the last question I have here, and then I'm going to open it up to the floor, is to this question of this retail chains. Basically, it says that, I'm operating a group of stores, kind of like Nairobi Bicycle, and even after reducing my cost structure, some of the stores are still negative EBITDA or EBITDA. What parameters do we need to consider in making a decision of whether to close or run the stores? Again, these are great questions. I think a lot of you are facing this, whether it's with retail locations or product lines or customers you serve. What I would say is the following. First of all, you want to keep all businesses that have positive contribution margins. And so if the business is providing positive contribution margin, or if that location is providing positive contribution margin to the organization, you need to keep it. And what you need to do is you need to weigh scenarios. What happens if we run the store, and what happens if we close the store? Closing the store may not actually eliminate all the costs. It may be that your loss is larger if you close the store than if you run it at a small deficit. And so that's something to be very careful of. I mean, imagine a store where your operating costs are $10,000, half labor, half rent. If currently you're generating $8,000 of revenue, you may actually say, all right, I'm losing $2,000, let's close the store. But if closing the store still requires you to pay rent, you're gonna lose $5,000 a month. And so it may actually make sense from a contribution point of view to actually incur the small loss than to capture the big cost if you can't eliminate all that rent expense. The second thing is, when you talk about underperforming stores, this is actually like Nairobi Bicycles. Maybe it's an opportunity to go back and revisit the characteristics of the stores that are underperforming. These may actually have been stores that were underperforming even before the pandemic. They might have been positive EBIT, but they may actually have been the worst performing stores. And if that's the case, there might actually be a strategic argument to be made that maybe capital would be better pulled out of those particular locations and redeployed into other locations. And so, like Nairobi Bicycles, this may not just be a symptom of the pandemic, it may be a symptom of the variation in performance across your portfolio of stores. And then last thing, before you close any locations, ask yourself, do they perform some kind of strategic role? Because it may be that they actually are important within the broad scope of the organization, even if they're losing money. It may be for brand awareness, it may be for customers to be able to try out the product. Ask yourself, are they fulfilling a role that still creates value? All right, those were a great set of questions. Why don't we open the floor up to questions that have been coming through chat. Odina, have we had any new questions come through that look exciting?
Yes, Joe, thank you. So I'll start with, we have a few actually that came in. So the first one is, do we concentrate on profitability, growth, or on cash flow in the current scenario?
Excellent question. And it kind of aligns with something I was talking about earlier. You really want both. In a perfect world, you want both. Cash flow is very near term. Cash flow becomes important when you're worried about liquidity. You can be very profitable, but actually have no liquidity. And so to the extent that you're selling product, but you're selling it on credit, to the extent that payments are being deferred, meaning cash receipts are being deferred, profitability can actually could actually cause problems in terms of your decision making, because you might miss the fact that you're actually running into a liquidity crisis because you're not going to collect the cash for 90 days. That said, profitability is the benchmark by which you evaluate economic performance, meaning you still want to make sure that your products are generating positive margin. You still want to make sure that your business is economically viable. So it's really about balancing the two, right? You can generate, I tell this to my MBA students a lot, you can generate a lot of cash if you sold your product at cost or even below cost, right? In the near term, that solves your liquidity problem. But it doesn't make sense economically to sell product all the time below cost. And that's where profitability becomes a really important metric to look at. And so what you want to do is you want to try to optimize profitability to the extent you can, recognizing you also need to create cash flow. And that's why we encourage sometimes the discounting of inventory now to create cash. You sacrifice a little bit on profitability to generate the cash you might need today. But in the long term, you want to build a business that's creating profits. And so what I would say is go back and look at the Nairobi Bicycles example. The slides are available. And look at some of the scenarios where you see how in the near term, the focus is on just having a positive cash balance. But as you get over longer horizons, it's about making sure you're only operating those locations and only selling those products that create long-term value, which is what profitability is. So great question. It's a bit of a nuanced answer, but that is part of what running a business is. It's a trade-off between the value creation and the cash flow creation needs in this moment of time. So any other questions, Adina?
Yes, we have a couple more.
Okay.
So for SMEs, how do we factor a strategic reservoir of liquid cash to be used in such black swan events, especially when we run on tight cash flow cycles?
Could you repeat the first part of that question? You kind of broke up on me. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. So for SMEs, how do we factor a strategic reservoir of liquid cash to be used in such black swan events?
Yeah. Okay, got it. Great question. Strategic reservoirs are obviously there to try to capitalize on positive NPV investments when they arise. When you start talking about black swan events, basically events that are as unusual and infrequent as what we're seeing here, this now becomes a strategic moment for the firm. If survival is dependent upon an infusion of cash, this may be the moment that you have to tap into that reserve. Obviously, in the normal course of operations, that reserve is there to be able to perhaps launch a new product line, acquire a competitor, engage in productive R&D when the opportunity arises, but that's the normal state of affairs. The minute you move into these types of scenarios, you have to look at all options for liquidity. And if that's the only option available to you, or it's the least risky option available, then it's one that you really do have to consider taking, because again, survival may depend upon it. But that's important. It has to be a case of survival since this is a strategic reserve. All right, great question, Odina. How about one more, and then we'll move into the breakout session.
Okay, sounds good. So here's a longer question.
Oh boy.
It is important to understand the impact of pandemic from a competitive landscape perspective. Suppose a business can survive the pandemic. Is this a good time to tackle competition? By investing a little on marketing, you may be able to get a bigger market share. What do you think? Absolutely
agree. If your liquidity position will allow you to do it, that's opportunity seeking at its finest, right? You have a competitive advantage in terms of liquidity that maybe your competitors don't. And so now might be the time to deploy the capital for that strategic action. Of course, it has to be the best use of capital at this moment in time. If it means putting your company financially at risk because you become constrained, then I would reevaluate. But if you have the liquidity, I think you absolutely want to capitalize at this particular point in time. And I'm actually going to say this is in line with a set of other questions that I got. I received a lot of questions about investment decisions during the pandemic, and marketing is an investment as well. And I'm going to talk a bit more about this after the breakout session. So great question, and it's a great transition to where we're going in the second half of today's session.